Hello and welcome to the Bestseller Experiment, a special deep dive episode that we record exclusively for our patrons on Patreon and our academates on the Bestseller Academy. And today we're getting forensic, and I mean that quite literally. We're going to be talking about forensics and all that wonderful stuff that makes this kind of crime thriller that uses forensics so gripping and really, really draws you in. But very often, it's completely wrong and erroneous. So I've got a couple of experts, and these two, I went to see these two speak at a writers group in Canterbury earlier this summer, and we were there for about 2 hours, I think, at least, and I could have sat there for another 2 hours. It was absolutely gripping. So we've got Dr. Devin Finaughty and Chandra Finaughty. Both of you, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
Simply couldn't resist. You two are absolutely brilliant. Now, normally, whenever I talk to an expert, particularly when I'm looking something up, the first question I ask when I'm researching is, what is it that frustrates you when you see your profession on TV or in books? What is it that people get wrong? And what became very, very clear from talking to you guys is that pretty much everything you see on the TV, pretty much everything you see in books can be very, very wrong. But first of all, let's find out who you are. Where are you in your career when it comes to forensics? So, Devin, let's start with you.
Alrighty. So I'm currently a lecturer in forensic science at the University of Kent, based here in Canterbury. Prior to that, I was a lecturer in biological anthropology, specialising in forensic anthropology, forensic taphonomy, also at the University of Kent. And prior to that, I was based at the University of Cape Town in South Africa as a lecturer in human anatomy and forensic science.
Wonderful, thank you. And Chandra, I should also add, was, of course, an Academy member. So, Chandra, lovely to see you again. But, of course, you're on a forensics journey as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, prior to discovering creative writing, I was very, very science-orientated and minded. And, yes, I specialized in forensics in my postgraduate education. So I've got two masters, both specializing in forensics, one from a South African university, the other from a UK-based university. At the moment, I am a teaching fellow on a specialist forensics program at King's College London. Broadly, my speciality is also similar to Devin in that forensic anthropology and anatomy background, a very close connection in South Africa. And we've worked on cases together in South Africa. And other than forensic anthropology, I'm quite interested and have done quite a bit of research and published on forensic genetics and looking at extracting DNA from bones and teeth. So, yeah.
Wonderful. I love the way you said we both worked on cases together in South Africa. That sounds like a Netflix show right there. I want to see that show. You guys solving crimes. But let's. We got a whole bunch of listener questions. So if you're a member of the Academy or if you're in our BXP group on Facebook as a Patreon, you get exclusive chance to ask wonderful people like this their ask questions. So let's talk about the things that people get wrong. So I've got a question here from William Group. He says, as an ex-EMT, it drives me crazy when I see someone on TV trying to check someone's pulse in the wrong spot. What are those forensic cringe moments that drive you crazy so we can avoid them?
Well, I can 100% say within the setting that we work in, there are no pulses. They are very much of the deceased variety, and in the case of Devin, quite long deceased.
Yeah, definitely decomposed or skeletonized. Yeah. I have legitimately seen a cause of death on the death certificate being written as skeletonization, which is not.
Yeah, you see some crazy stuff, and it's not. This is one thing to say. It's not just Sometimes, yes, lay people can get the science wrong, and it comes through in popular press, like popular media, such as TV shows, movies, books. But the science itself is not always perfect. So, and I think Devin and I spoke at length to this about to the group when we had the writing session, some of the way that the science is shown to be so powerful, and given all the answers in those movies, TV shows, perhaps books, and when it goes to a real situation, particularly when it's tested in court, because forensics, you can put anything in front of forensics or behind forensics, because all it is relating to the court and to a judicial system. But yes, so it's also the science. So I think we as forensic scientists know the term quite well, CSI effect. Yes. And I'm not so sure if that's something that is gone into the general population, but the CSI effect is seen as this putting the evidence into a much higher standing of confirming something than actually would be seen in a real life situation.
So in short, it raises people's expectations far higher than what it can actually deliver in reality. And I suppose that's one of the biggest things that TV does, is that it creates these unrealistic expectations.
Books, TV shows.
Yeah. And part of it is along timelines. So the time that it takes to process evidence in general is sped up a lot, which makes sense. I mean, for the narrative structure.
When you have a 45-minute show, you don't want to have an extraction method taken 24 hours. Yes. So you don't want to be shown all that boring sciencey things that do take hours and hours, and interpreting the results can take a long time as well. Yeah.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, you hear on shows, I need this DNA identified within 24 hours. That doesn't happen, does it?
It can happen.
Nowadays,
usually, so the instrumentation and the techniques can certainly give you a profile depending on what sample is in quite a short time, within a day. The issue is that when you're taking that to a real life situation where these are done by only a specific number of laboratories within any country, and those laboratories are being filtered by many scenes or cases that are under question, and they want to DNA profile, let's take an example with DNA, that's kind of where the backlog happens in that processing and prioritizing. So just as you might prioritize in the ER room, there is some prioritization that happens in a forensic laboratory. So certainly high profile cases can be quite a quick turnaround time. But general cases can take quite long. And I believe that the UK and generally countries around the world do report on their backlogs. They have to, because they are beholden to government entities and legal courts. So they have to report their backlogs.
But going back to your original point, which is what, this thing, the CSI effect, is this thing where we do expect miracles of forensic science to point the finger squarely at someone, no doubt whatsoever. But we are seeing that there have been some terrible miscarriages of justice because of this effect, essentially. And jurors, because they've watched a few seasons of CSI, might think they're experts. So this is quite a dangerous thing, isn't it?
It is. But the point that you raised there, Mark, is also has another side to it, and it's something that Chandra mentioned earlier, which is that the science itself isn't perfect. And many of these miscarriages of justice haven't been at the hands of jurors who have misunderstood evidence, but rather scientists who have misrepresented evidence. Right. Bad science in court is throughout the world. And it's been the subject of a lot of criticism, mainly in the United States, but also quite recently here in the UK. And it's forced a reckoning within forensic science disciplines to really improve the rigor and the quality of the science underpinning the methods. And that's what drives mine and Chandra's research is really moving towards that, to make sure that we really are certain, because the stakes in a forensic case are very high. And that's a massive responsibility as both as a practitioner and as a researcher.
Yeah. And I think that there's a standard fear among forensic scientists is to let the guilty go free. And I'm sure this happens like with other police and perhaps lawyers that have a moral compass. But more than that, putting someone innocent behind bars, like that is just, that shouldn't happen. Unfortunately, there are instances of this. And sometimes it's just with that translation of what is quite a rigorous scientific process into the court system, where you're dealing with lay people. And there are many instances where, quite a few examples, where forensic scientists or those within the forensic field just have gotten it wrong.
Right.
So forensic odontology has borne the brunt of this as a discipline. There's a really good show on Netflix called The Innocence Files, and it tracks a lot of these miscarriages of justice. And forensic odontology features uncomfortably frequently. Right. But that in turn has driven professionalization within that specific discipline. And having an awareness of the downfalls and the pitfalls and the shortcomings of the science is really important, both for jurors and for scientists.
And you do have the thing as experts for hire. And typically these are the defense looking for an expert, and they will just shop around until they find an expert that might not fully agree with the prosecution, and they're like, yes, I will pay you this amount if you can come today, and which shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be the case, because a forensic scientist, you do not have, even if has caused a debate within the field with because some countries have their forensic science still attached to government entities, and of course government entities then have like prosecution. Seeing that, so there's concern of conflict of interest. But at the end of the day, a forensic expert, even though if they might be testifying on the side of the prosecution, I'm saying that in inverted commas, they're not there to support the prosecution's argument. They are there to present their science through an expert report that they have written, and they would be defending that for the court. Now, in the UK, you would be presenting to the jury, not the judge per se, because it's a jury-based legal system. Other countries have, where they don't have a jury system, such as South Africa, you would just be presenting to the judge.
Okay, let's go to the scene of the crime. We've got a question from Andrew Guile, who says, "Is there an accepted way to work a crime scene from a forensic standpoint?" I remember one of the things that really surprised me when talking to you guys over the summer. You said the scene is called a scene of death. There's no presumption of a crime. It's led by evidence. So tell us about what a lot of writers listening to this who write mysteries and thrillers, they're going to have a scene of the crime, but even that nomenclature might be wrong. Tell us about that.
So basically the way that it is that you might have a police may get a report of some sort of incident, and they will go to the scene, and they might at that point then declare it a crime scene because of whatever that context looks like. Crime scenes can have bodies, but not every crime scene has a body.
Right.
And not every scene that has a body is a crime scene.
Right.
And the
easiest
aversion of presumption is quite important, because if you bring presumption into it, it could alter your investigative efforts.
Yeah.
And you could potentially miss something out then, or misdirect the case.
Yeah. So sometimes, and I'm thinking about quite a famous case in South Africa, where it was believed that this individual committed suicide. And in that case, that's not a crime scene. That's death scene, and it's a forensic death investigation or medical legal death investigation, depending on which country you are in. And so that's not the crime scene, because a crime doesn't necessarily have been committed.
Mm-hmm.
And in this instance, there was this, and I knew the person that went to scene, and they had said that it didn't, and it's weird because they didn't have a lot of evidence, but this didn't seem like a suicide. Now, it might seem strange to someone that this individual had said it just doesn't look like a suicide scene, but at the same time, this individual had seen thousands, perhaps, suicide scenes, and something didn't match. In that instance, that's what has started as a death scene, and retrieving a body and perhaps finding evidence of what could have contributed to that person's death, such as if there's any ligatures, if there's any drug paraphernalia around, because it's all going to build a picture of a cause of death.
Mm-hmm.
But at that instance, if there is some evidence that maybe the person had a ligature around their neck and the body was facing downwards, and then they turn the body around and there is a knife stick, like in the heart or something like that, then you might, okay, well, why did this individual hand themselves? And then there was someone else perhaps here. So then that might be declared as a crime, potentially something. Then that might be declared as a crime scene. And there might be slight nuances of how a death scene might be processed versus how a crime scene would be processed.
Yeah. Now, one of the things to point out is that the specific protocols that are followed is jurisdiction specific.
Yeah.
So each investigative force, which might be attached to a police force, it might be contracted in by a police force. Not every country has. So the UK has got county-based police forces. South Africa, for example, has got a federal level police force. It's just one police service for the entire country. And each one of those is going to specify their precise protocols. But there's some general principles which will underpin processing of a scene. And the very first one is to secure that scene. You need to try and preserve it in its state as far as possible, keep members of the public out, not only to preserve the scene, but also for their own safety. The scene might be dangerous.
Yeah, you have to ensure this, like that's one that you taught. You have to ensure that it is safe for you, let's say, to enter this building, to enter this house. There's not a gas leak, there's not whatever that might be. One that comes to mind that's seen as particularly risky is carbon monoxide poisoning. So if this is expected, the scene, whether it's crime scene or death scene, cannot be processed until the scene is safe. There's also complications sometimes with scenes that have bodies, is that paramedics might have been there if this individual wasn't dead already by the time first responders. And first responders, they're not trained in forensics, and they can often really make a scene quite messy. Like
in the interest of saving someone's life.
Obviously, yes, it's very much yeah. I mean, you don't want it to become a death investigation, yes. But it can make the scene a little bit there's going to be then that further contamination that's coming into it. So always a rule of thumb is to make sure the scene is safe, secure it, because you want to preserve the evidence that is there. And that's the key. And also timeliness. Timeliness is very important to get to scenes. Evidence can often, depending on what evidence, can degrade.
Yeah.
And that's why you have the blue alarm going and the blue lights going to get to scene on time and to process it at scene as efficient. That's why you might, and there's examples of this in the media where scenes are processed into the night because, or they have the tents over with lights and all that because they want to ensure that they're getting the highest integrity of evidence.
Mm-hmm. So once that scene's been secure and it's ensured that it's safe, then that's when the planning starts. So you'll have a scene. In the UK, we have a scene of crime manager who will then coordinate all the different parties that are involved. That may involve interviewing first responders if they've been at the scene, just to get a sense of what is there, what might have happened, interviewing any witnesses. Just before anyone goes into that scene, just get a sense of what is known, right? Establish that baseline. Yeah. Then they will identify a path of approach, so an evidence-free pathway through that scene to do a preliminary survey of the scene.
And it's not the one that they think the perpetrator might have taken.
Right.
So you want to avoid the perpetrator's path as far as possible. So sometimes when we get examined on scene, it must just look really funny because we're all in ice cream suits and we're like hugged up against the wall, shimmying across.
Not taking the obvious path. Yeah,
because you can't take the obvious path because you're sure that any of that evidence that's left behind from a perpetrator is preserved.
And the ways that you can create that path, right? You get these like clear plastic. They look like the little mini footstools almost. They're about that high. And they come in stacks and you just stack them out. And that means that you can then basically step over things, but you're now stepping over you're above the floor. And so you're not disturbing the scene. You can move through that.
So did you call them ice cream suits?
Yes.
Yes, we call them ice cream suits.
These are the paper suits, the paper forensic suits.
Yeah.
Why are they called ice cream suits?
I mean, it's probably not a British thing, but in South Africa, we call them ice cream suits. I don't know why.
I don't know either.
I wouldn't know what.
They don't keep things cool. You die of heat stroke inside them.
Yeah, they're very uncomfortable to wear.
They're impermeable to fluids and to air in that. So.
And they actually because I was, as a part of my forensic archaeology assessment, when I was doing my second master's degree, I had to wear one of these the entire day. And even though it was winter, it's still like really uncomfortable for movement. So you don't envy those scene of crime officers going into the SOCOs, going in with their suits and having to process it.
In the height of summer, it's Missouri. I once had to help excavate a grave in Cape Town in December, and it was 35 degrees and it was abysmal.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
You can't just like step out and, take everything off, air it out and then go straight back in. You'd have to strip all of that off and put it all back on because one of the purpose of those ice cream suits is one, to ensure that you don't contaminate the scene and also that the scene doesn't contaminate you.
Yes.
And so it kind of like surgery, once you're on and you're dressed, you're in there and you stay in there until you move out. And if you do move out, you have to go through that whole process.
And also while we're on PPE, there is a method to put in PPE on.
Yes, right. A personal protective equipment.
Yeah, and the PPE, sorry for anyone, that's what we call personal protective equipment, which the white suits are a part of. So at minimum, if you're processing a crime scene, you'll have the white suit, you'll have shoe overlays, and you'll have a mask, and you'll double glove, because one glove you'll put on to put in your suit, and then you would put on your mask, and then you'll put on your second outside gloves.
Right. Wow.
And then tape your sleeves. Tape those gloves to your sleeves.
And as I'm sure you can see from the media, and I think Hot Fuzz does it brilliantly. Have you watched Hot Fuzz?
I love Hot Fuzz. Yeah.
Where they go into the crime scene and like everyone's in their white suits and he's like, oh, looking for his partner, and he goes to the run one a few times. It's really like that.
Although, just to point out, him just being able to waltz into that scene and walk around.
Completely inaccurate.
I thought
Obviously
so.
not.
Trampling over there.
But everyone looking the same in those suits is accurate. So a lot of people might put their initials in black marker at the back, or
Right.
whatever it might
Just
be.
so you know
They
who's
don't tend to put their names, because if it's a high profile case, you don't want your name to be on the back.
No.
So they might just put
Flashed all over
initials.
the news.
Might just put their initials on, or somewhere else, so that you know who you're speaking to.
This is brilliant. Andrew Garth follows up. He's got another question. So how do detectives view scene of the crime officers? Are they helpful, geniuses, slow, boring, pedantic, equals, beneath them, indifferent to them? Is there some kind of rivalry there? How does that all work?
Okay, so one of the things to point out to your listeners is that Chandra and I haven't practiced forensic casework in the UK yet, because you have to have 3 years of continuous residency in the UK to do that.
Which we've achieved now.
Which we've now achieved. So, we can so in answering this question for Andrew, we can reflect on our own experience with the equivalents in South Africa. But I did also ask one of my colleagues in forensic science about this morning. He worked for the Met Police for a very long time. And he said that and he's given me permission to share his answer. He said, in general, the relationship is actually quite good. Mm-hmm. It has changed over time because, of course, he said when he started, the scene of crime officers were embedded in CID, whereas now they're a separate unit. But he said, as a general rule of thumb, if you share a kettle with someone, the working relationship is really good. And so,
very British.
Very British.
Very British.
Essentially British.
As you introduce those degrees of separation, it can become a little bit trickier, right? Because then people don't always necessarily understand the nuances of the job. In our experience in South Africa, forensic anthropology and forensic taphonomy, and those disciplines are not formalized in the forensic death investigative process in South Africa. So us being invited to go into a case is really at the behest of the forensic pathologist. So we're very much guests at the scene. And so we've had to build those relationships very carefully over time. And so we were very lucky. We enjoyed really good working relationships, both with the pathologists, the forensic pathology service at large, and with the police that are on scene. And a big component of doing that is just sharing our knowledge about what we're doing. They're often really interested, like, okay, why are you collecting that? What are you doing? What kind of information can you get? And if you are willing to teach them and share with them and not treat them like they're dumb or that they don't know what they're doing, that goes a long way. Same as if we have a request, we back that request up with a really clear reason. Like, would you be able to do this for me, so that we can improve this or get that evidence out in a better way, improve and always bringing it back and saying, like, the more that we can get and the better the integrity of the evidence, it will help us help you do your job.
And just to point out that there is a deficit of some of these specialist fields within forensics not being used in the UK too, or not being used in the way or an extent they could be used. Forensic taphonomy is an example, forensic entomology is an example, forensic botany. So forensic archaeology and forensic anthropology, I would say, are a little bit better integrated than those other more niche fields. And I think there was a question surrounding that.
Yes, we'll come back to that in a minute, because I think Angela has a question about looking up specifics, that kind of thing. But to go back to Andrew's original question, I don't think you've given us a very helpful answer, because, professionals working together with mutual respect, that doesn't make for good drama. We need the bitter cop.
We did subsequently speak about this and said that at the end of the day, like, you perhaps cannot avoid clash in personalities.
Right.
Like that will happen. And that's an example in any workplace. So in the police officer's office, in the forensic sciences office, yes, there will be personalities. And Devin and I have certainly worked with personalities in the past, and personality is a nice word.
I think another circumstance where you might get some tensions introduced is when there are competing priorities, right? So if if there's a real time constraint on getting the case processed or getting evidence, whatever it may be, that might conflict with the rigor that is generally required for the evidence collection, preservation, processing, and all of that. And so then you might get some pressure from the investigative side saying, like, we need that information now. And but it really depends on the situation.
Well, that brings me to Christopher Wills's question here, who says, how quick is scene of the crime evidence analysed and the results available to the police? Because the police often can only hold someone for so long. Is it 96 hours or something like that in the UK? So how quickly can the evidence be analysed and presented in order to charge someone for a crime?
As heavy as the pressure is to do it, as I said, like, it can be quick. It just depends at if it's high profile, if it's not, if it's low profile. Typically, if you have a suspect, and there is a time limit, then yes, that would be perhaps processed at a higher priority, where there's an unknown suspect or there's virtually no information about it. Mm-hmm. It also would really depend what evidence they're looking at. Unfortunately, some evidence might just inherently take longer than others. But if you are perhaps, it's also if you are collecting anything from the suspect itself, often under certain crimes, an arrested person in the UK can have their DNA profile taken. Like, mm-hmm. it's allowed in the law. And it depends like what you wanted to do with that profile later on. It kind of really, it depends on the situation. So it can be quick, but it has to be quite well motivated and potentially go high up as to why this needs to be done.
Yeah. Because it'll generally involve more resources, but it will also entail then a greater level of scrutiny, because as soon as you accelerate a process, you increase the risk of errors being introduced, errors of interpretation or contamination, things like that. So they will be subject to greater scrutiny as well. Mm-hmm. But it really depends on the nature of the evidence. Some evidence is quick to process, and others, some chemical tests take a while. DNA processing is limited by the technology, whereas you can get a mobile device and get the data off of it like that, really quickly.
Yeah, and I see it at MetPolice. So MetPolice is like also trialing, like doing rapid DNA, for example, like instrument that does rapid DNA. And I can give you results in a few hours, like type of thing, or even less than that. So it's and that's another thing to highlight, is that certainly there is powerful technologies out there, wonderful technologies. Why it doesn't filter so well down to the forensics level is because it comes back to it being accepted into court, and it being meeting evidential standards,
which are very rigorous.
Which are very rigorous, and often, like, if those technologies would need to be validated and go under a series of validation within a forensic setting before they can be deemed as being able to be used in a court setting. So we do see a lag in forensics in terms of advancement compared to others. And that's not to say that there's a lag in the research. The research is good. It's leaps and bounds and it's getting there. It's just that there's a lag to get it from the research into practice, into casework practice.
And that really does take time.
That's absolutely fascinating. Christopher has a quick follow-up question. Which bits of scene of crime evidence used on TV shows and novels makes you groan and think, oh, if only it was possible, if only that was possible in real life? Do you see sort of impossible leaps of logic or as you say, technology that might not be have gone through that verification process? What's the stuff that makes you groan?
And DNA is a big one.
DNA, sure, maybe. But I just remember CSI. CSI is like one of the Yeah.
Good entertainment value.
Good entertainment.
Good side.
But they have this instrument. They have this instrument that does everything. And like you put a little speck of paint on it and it tells you like the manufacturer. It tells you like where it was made for, where it's been, what other crime scenes. Like, no, that doesn't happen. Right. and also they, sometimes, you know, they get the if they put like profile, and I've never really seen a proper profile presented in CSI, but you know, it's got the postcode of the individual and the photo and blah blah and all that. So no.
Another one for me that's from TV series Bones is eyeballing a skeleton and saying, well, they're male, they're this old and this tall and they come from this place, and like no, like an osteobiographical analysis takes hours.
It takes hours if we want to do it correctly. We've also seen a bone misidentified. Yeah. So
yeah, I think a lot of
and PPE. I have a bugbear with PPE, and obviously there's a reason why they don't have their good-looking actors or actresses in the white suits, because they want to show them. But yeah, I think that I would say in that instance, books and novels are a little bit further ahead in at least fictional ones, a little bit further ahead in being able to get some of that accuracy, and that might be because they're not limited by, you know, having a couple of hours or, you know, 45 minutes to showcase whatever that might be. So
another one that I can think of, which comes up routinely, is just because I was thinking of it in terms of like the presentation of autopsies, especially in popular media.
Yeah, quite inaccurate.
It's very sterilized and very clean. Autopsies are not like that. They're really messy and smelly and not very pleasant to be around at all. No. Yeah. But the one that's related to that I can think of is time since death estimation. Right. It's, you know, very often they'll come up with an estimate really quickly, and it'll be very precise. And precise time since death estimates are very rare because they're notoriously difficult to ascertain. As I shared with you all in the summer, the decomposition process is unique to each and every person. No two bodies decompose the same way.
In the ground, above the ground, in the ocean, in the river. and
there's so many factors you have to quantitatively take into account. And we lack technology to take into account a lot of these variables still to this day. So I would say that within the first 72 hours, you could get a reasonably precise post-mortem interval, time since death estimate. But as soon as you top side of 72 hours, it becomes increasingly difficult, and it gets more and more. By the time the body's a skeleton, your error margin is in the weeks and the months, maybe even the years.
And I suppose that's why there's this point, like with those very niche specialized scientists, and like I've seen some forensic scientists coming out with fiction books now, and like I would say that Kathy Rice is probably the most popular one to think of.
Which are quite good from a scientific accuracy perspective.
Practicing forensic anthropologist, and you know the science is good. She finds an inordinate amount of bodies everywhere she goes, obviously because it needs to be dramatized. I can tell you now, I've never found, neither have Devin, stumbled upon a body on any of our walks anywhere in the world. So that's totally dramatized.
Not in Canterbury, you know.
Well,
you'll probably be surprised how many serious crimes there are in Canterbury if you look the stats up.
Yeah, well, there was actually human remains found in one of my running routes.
Not when you went running though.
Yeah, but it was suspicious. Yeah, wasn't suspicious. So.
Wow.
I didn't find it.
I've got a question from Angela Nurse, which sort of follows on from that. In terms of what she said, generally, when you watch factual programs on true crime like Expert Witness, are they giving you a really high level overview of the forensics? And she goes on, when including elements of forensics in a fiction book, how detailed do you think someone should go? So you said novels seem to be a little bit ahead of TV and film when it comes to getting this stuff right. But I guess that's because a novel has a little bit more room to breathe in terms of presenting procedures correctly. Is that fair? And something like Expert Witness, is that, if I'm an author watching Expert Witness, should I take a lot of that? Should I be taking notes or should I be digging deeper?
If it's for a book, I think shows like Expert Witness are a good place to start because they are factual, they're more documentary based, there's less dramatization. So
they might be actual police officers, detectives, expert forensic scientists that were part of this criminal process in whatever way it may be.
Yeah, so you can definitely take notes, but if you want to dig deeper, especially if you're trying to, even if it's just as the author for your own edification, improving your understanding so that you can figure out how to communicate just enough information to your readers that they understand what they need to understand without extraneous information. You can look up the forensic science regulators guidelines, because forensic science regulator stipulates minimum criteria for all major forensic disciplines in the UK, what those techniques have to do, who's involved, all of that. And that's all that information is available online for free.
Yeah, there's tons of resources that is available online. Like you can go and look up exactly how many DNA profiles are on the National DNA Database, and it gives you it'll report on any backlogs and how many are from crime scene samples and how many are perpetrator samples and victims, and so
and
there's,
you can
there's
look
a lot
up
of
actual crime scene stats.
Yeah, definitely. And if you're wanting, and I would say that if you wanted to have a very realistic sort of fictional story, if that makes any sense, have a look, be inspired by some of the real forensic cases that are out there.
Yeah, watching true crime is
I think
that
we spoke about it because I think sometimes that what fictional authors might try to do is have these very elaborate death scenes and people dying and being killed in these very elaborate ways, where majority of cases that doesn't happen. Sometimes there might not be a weapon, there might just be a corner of a table, and I've been to a case like that. So it's looking at and I 100% agree, having a look at what are those real crimes that have happened, those real the perpetrators, and perhaps motives, those that are being arrested, and perhaps even courts. It's very, very, very boring, but you can go and get court documents, and you can go and see examples of exactly the exact records of an expert witness, what their testimony was.
Yeah,
so,
and you can go into court. You can go and watch trials.
Old Bailey, great place to go. Or
you can watch on YouTube. YouTube's got tons of expert witness testimony channels and you can. So I use them to teach my students.
It's exceedingly boring. I can tell you now. It's not very exciting. But you know what? You can go in there and you can go and pick up the language, because the language, particularly in UK courts, is because it's rooted in a very long legal history and in tradition. There's very specific language that is used, and there's also language that certain experts in certain fields might use. So, for example, forensic taphonomy, you have postmortem interval or time since death, and it would be looking at what's being used more frequently.
Brilliant.
There's something I just wanted to add on to what Chandra was saying about constructing elaborate death scenes and that. If the author is trying to make their characters' lives difficult, it's often the most seemingly mediocre scenes that are the most challenging and the most difficult, where there are very few lines of evidence and there's been very little interaction between the perpetrator and the victim and the scene. Those are the hardest scenes to crack. They don't have to be elaborate or fancy.
Sometimes around circumstantial evidence. A very poignant example of this happening at the moment is the nurse that's on trial and being accused of essentially killing little babies. And the post-mortem evidence and the medical evidence is difficult to interpret because of the way that some of these deaths were presented. What is being presented in court is a pattern and a lot of circumstantial evidence, witness reports, character profile. That's not correct.
Yeah.
Character profile of the individual. So I would say like sometimes those ones that might slip under and not be this extravagant. Harder.
I mean, I guess it's sort of post Thomas Harris Red Dragon Silence of the Lambs, where there's an elaborate genius serial killer, but I guess the truth is these things are often quite banal and in their own evil way. You know, there's it's often serial killers aren't a genius, they just have opportunities and do terrible things that we wouldn't necessarily, you know, dream of doing, which is a lot scarier.
And they can do it over very, very long periods of time as well. Like Fred and Rose West did it for 30 years.
Yeah.
And because it was so infrequent and there was always some kind of plausible deniability attached to it, they sort of just, you know, skirted under the radar. I mean, they landed on the authorities' radar a number of times, but as Chandra pointed out, it's always circumstantial, you know, and things, you know, get swept under the carpet or overlooked and stuff happens. And eventually the weight of evidence becomes overwhelming. Like that pattern becomes undeniable. Yeah. And that's invariably when people get caught.
Yeah. And cold case is always very interesting. And especially like looking at the way that technologies are progressing, you're getting more instances where cold cases are now being solved. And even to the point where not really it was cold case, but new evidence comes to light and linked to miscarriages of justice, people that have been arrested or exonerated. So there's tons. I mean, I can see why there are shelves and shelves of, you know, crime thrillers, mystery, and because there are so many different facets to explore and so many
very rich
and so many
field.
Different angles to look at, because the angle of a character from a policing background will be very difficult from an angle of a forensic scientist or one that's from a medical background. And also those, because some forensic scientists might be working within a laboratory attached to like a private forensic service, particularly in the UK, but also in the UK and elsewhere in the world, you can have forensic experts that are actually somewhat contracted out, but they're private individuals, and these are often ones that come from an academic background, a research background, that have PhDs and decades of research and publications and all that. And that angle is quite different to someone that's in being in the police or working in a lab or
Good stuff. Angela has a follow-up question. I mean, you were talking about all these amazing resources. You can go to court, you can look at reports, the YouTube channels, all this kind of stuff. But are there factual books that you would recommend for writers? You know, is there a good place to start that can take you elsewhere? And she has a follow-up. Do you know of any for entomology aimed at authors? But we'll come to that in a second. But is it like a, I mean, what I'd be looking for is kind of a one-stop, almost dummies guide to forensics that would then help me find other resources.
The dummies guide to forensics is actually pretty good.
Yeah, this is gonna sound like bad, but there are textbooks written for lawyers.
Yeah.
So
right. That's a really good place to start.
They're not for those that have a science background. They're written for lawyers that might, you know, these are educated people, but they don't come from a science
because they've got like taking forensic science into a courtroom is very much an exercise in translation. Like forensic science and speaks a totally different language to legalese. And the big challenge for the expert witness is that translation, like making the science lucid and interpretable to lay people. And, we're operating in their space, in playing in their ball court. So we've got to do it by their rules, using their language and that. And so, I totally agree with Chandra. Like, if you can get hold of, I think textbooks, popular books are interesting, but might be quite specific. If you're wanting something that's sort of general, a textbook aimed at a lawyer on, forensics in general would be a really good place to start.
And King's College London actually has a MOOC on FutureLearn called like The Science Behind Forensic Science. I think I showed it when we spoke in July. That's also could be a good, unless you want a certificate.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's not me being like, yay, King's College Forensics, because I'm here as a private individual, not with the university, but it is a good one.
Have you got a link that we could share with the listeners?
Yeah, 100%. I will send it to you.
Wonderful.
It's free. It's freely available. There's also one that's on FutureLearn that was done with Teesside and another university on forensic anthropology and forensic archaeology. That might be helpful too.
We'll put that in the show notes, folks. You can check that out.
I can't say I can think of one specific textbook that would cover everything, because there's actually so many out there. But I can put a list together.
And just list. Angela's very specific request about anything on entomology. Yes.
They're
entomologist.
There are a couple of books. There's one in particular, which the name eludes me right now, but it was written by two lawyers two forensic entomologists who became lawyers, and they wrote this very short. It wasn't even a textbook. It was kind of like what Chandra's described, right? It was like a book for lawyers, like it was aimed at lawyers on forensic entomology, and it was profound in its insightfulness, because they managed to present the science so eloquently, but in a way that they were able to identify where potential holes were in the way evidence gets presented, because that's what they were aiming for. And I've always said this, and I say it to students frequently, that often the best, if you want to be a really effective lawyer, be a forensic scientist first, and then become a lawyer,
right.
And then go.
If you want to work, be a criminal lawyer.
A criminal lawyer, yeah, because then you will see both sides of the coin, and you will be empowered to pick out where science is being presented incorrectly, and also to guide your case narrative much more strongly. I'll find the name of the book and I will send it to you, Mark, so you can share it for Angela, because that would be a really good one, I think.
Fantastic.
And also, any pressing questions, I'm a part of bestsellers. You can field it through me, and hello, expert.
Wonderful stuff. Finally, one last question, as Columbo might say. Question from Tracy Montague. Given how quickly science and technology moves, how do you write without getting easily outdated? Is less more in that case? So, is something writing about a specific scientific technique, is it going to look dated? Or, as you said earlier, a lot of these things take a long time to kind of get validated and become part of the process. What would you recommend there?
I would say that into the sense, if we take an example, DNA, and that's one that's, very, very popularized and seen as like, it is still a golden standard in certain forensic science questions. And the technology has advanced greatly within 10 years. But at the moment, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon, what information that a DNA profile can tell you about an individual, and what it's going to be based on comparison to a known and known profile, a known and an unknown profile, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And I don't think necessarily that as a fictional writer, that your reader might be interested that, okay, well, the QIAM DNA investigator kit was used and it was on an ABI genetic analyzer 6500. Like that's so good.
Hope you're taking notes, guys.
I mean, sure, like you could go to that detail and yes, that technology will advance and there will be newer standards. But I think you can get away with that by taking the information that you can get from a certain piece of evidence and letting that rather be true to the power that evidence can give than actually the technology to behind it.
Yeah, I think the underlying principles behind these investigative techniques don't change dramatically. You know, once a technique or a principle has been developed and validated, it tends to stick. Our precision and quality of extracting information out of that and the power that we can get out of it improves continuously as technology improves. But I don't think, if an author was writing about DNA, for example, there aren't many labs that will have access to next generation sequencing, for example, but most labs will be able to do gel electrophoresis and
capillary electrophoresis.
Capillary electrophoresis. What's on jobs?
You failed.
You're the geneticist. And I think one of the other things also just to point out in this context is that the technology that's available is very context specific. They're not because labs tend to be privately funded, either through the police or it's like in the UK, you're going to have a private company or the police are going to be doing their own in-house forensics. In South Africa, the government pays for it. But in many of those contexts, it's a resource-constrained environment. So you could have this amazing, outstanding, brand new technology that you want to incorporate, but it might not be very widely available. So it pays to do a little bit of research for the scene, the setting that you're writing in.
Yeah, and I think the research is key to look at, okay, what are the police being used? And, it's reported, like, for example, for DNA, it's reported what the court accepts, which is DNA 17, and you can go onto a government website, you can see what exactly it is, and that level of detail is fine. Going back to the example of entomology, a fly is going to be a fly. The fly is not going to change, and then something very dramatic happens.
And you using the principle of growth.
Yeah, and if you're looking at for PMI and looking at, as Devin rightly said, growth and development, that's going to stay the same. What might be a little bit more in modern time would be using, for example, DNA to identify a fly species rather than a key or waiting for a maggot to develop into a fly, because it's quite difficult. So I would say that perhaps those that are interested in those sorts of niche fields, looking at perhaps some of the history of the field, and some textbooks do this very well, especially if you're an author that's really, really interested, for example, in forensic entomology or forensic anthropology. It's always good and we had to be an expert within a field. You really have to know the history and how it was done, the old ways, to say the traditional ways, before you can really start applying newer technologies, because you have to have a very strong theoretical background.
Yep. Wonderful. If you listen carefully, you can hear all these people scratching pencils and pens, taking countless notes. This has been absolute gold. Chandra, Devin, thank you so much for your time today. This has been absolutely brilliant. And I hope to speak to you again both real soon.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Mark.
you so much.
A real pleasure.
Hope that it's been somewhat helpful.
Oh, it's brilliant. Thank you.